Thank you very much. So I will very quickly present my PhD research. My doctorate is from the University of Navarra. And what I tried to do was make sense of all the different solutions that were proposed for the problem of online mis- and disinformation. New slide, please. So after 2016, there was general fear and horror around the world. The Brexit vote, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the election of Donald Trump. And there was a feeling that something had to be done about online mis- and disinformation. The problem was part of the problem was people wanted to take action before they actually knew what precisely the problem was and what would work. New slide, please. So I'd say the first thing that happened was a lot of conferences and reports trying to understand what exactly had gone wrong. New slide. And then there was the definition of what exactly mis- and disinformation was. I don't have time to talk about the research I've done on the 1930s, but in the 1930s, faced with Nazi propaganda, there were similar attempts to clarify and do taxonomies and just show the differences between outright lies, propaganda, things taken out of context. There's a whole sort of literature on what mis- and disinformation is, but we will not go into that today. Next slide, please. And then part of what I tried to do in my dissertation was understand why so many intelligent people had different solutions for the problem. And here I think that the work presented yesterday by Dr. Van Dijk was extremely useful. I think some of the comments about the difference between the US, the Chinese, and the European model are very relevant here. I argue that there were three reasons for the different solutions. One is the financial interests. It's evident, and I've talked about this yesterday, Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo was commenting, that the big tech companies had absolutely no incentive to support regulation because their motive was a profit motive. Then, of course, there are the beliefs of the groups proposing the solutions. So one example, journalists always think that the solution to every problem is more journalism. So the journalists kept saying, if only we'd written more about this problem of the tech companies, we wouldn't have had this terrible situation. The Europeans tend to believe in regulation, so their proposals were more regulatory, and the US has an aversion to government regulation, so they believe that the tech companies should solve the problem. There was an earlier comment about the EU during the pandemic, trying to get the tech companies to change their own behavior. And this is also what happened after 2016. The first thing the EU did was call the tech companies in and ask them to change how they were dealing with mis- and disinformation. The regulation came later. And then, of course, the exposure effect. Everybody believes that what they do is the right thing to do, and so they keep doing more of it. And so those, I think, were part of why we saw very different solutions. Next paragraph, please. Sorry, next slide. Yeah. So what I did, and this is totally illegal for communication scholars, was I divided the solutions into supply, transmission, and demand. And this is not at all how communication scholars think about communication, but I wanted to make it really simple. And in my taxonomy, I went from small to big. So what I call the demand side solutions are all the ones that have to do with audience and individual responsibility. And you could say, of course, that this is more the American way. So I put things like media literacy training, building trust and community participation in news, fact-checking, labeling. I put this mostly in the demand because it's about the user, and that fits with some of what we were talking about, media literacy, for example, or self-awareness. And there is some overlap with supply. And then on the supply side, I put everything that had to do with the supply of information. So the idea of information provisioning, that we need counter speech, that we need more speech, that we need journalists to expose the problem. All the things like truth in advertising and the transparency and the disclosure, I put that in the supply side. Using algorithms to suppress or downrank information, removing bots, deplatforming. I put that in the supply side. Things like advertising boycotts that we're trying to change, or the German NetzDG law. I put all of that in the supply side because it was trying to change the incentives. Banning or taxing micro-targeting, hate speech laws, making the intermediaries liable, the Facebook Supreme Court, content moderation. I put this all in the supply side. And again, I'm sorry if it's simplistic, but I found it easy because once we had this taxonomy and this division, we could start to look more closely at each of the solution because we knew where it fit in the overall framework. Next slide, please. And again, I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Next slide, please. Yeah. So one movement that started around the world was we have to get people to engage with media, to trust quality information, and to understand how journalists work. So this movement took place all over the world. Those of you in communications studies will remember the public journalism movement of the 1990s. A lot of this was funded by foundations and philanthropy. And the idea was, if we could just, and journalists believed in this, if we could just get people to understand what journalism is and to learn to identify quality information, then they won't fall for the garbage. They won't look at Facebook and believe it. They won't get confused by Fox News. They'll understand, what journalism is, and maybe they'll even start subscribing, and that will even help journalism. So this movement is still going on all over the world. I have many examples, and the pro could help journalism survive financially. The cons, I've never been convinced that educating people about the media will actually remove their desire to believe false information. It's also very expensive and it's very hard to scale. Not against it. I don't think it's the solution to the problem. New slide. Fact-checking movement. This, again, is something that's gone on for decades in the US. After 2016, we saw Facebook putting lots more money into fact-checking, and so did some of the foundations. Again, the hope was, I think, from Facebook, if we put money into fact-checking, we won't get regulated. So it's now a global movement. It exists basically in every, major media market around the world. It's brought journalists together. So you've had groups of journalists during the Mexican elections or the Brazilian elections, fact-checking politicians. The pros, it raises awareness about truth and evidence gathering and verification. It holds public and politicians and public figures to account, which is wonderful. The bad news is it comes late. So fact-checking takes place after the disinformation has already circulated very widely. And the studies show that the people who see the fact checks often aren't the people who saw the disinformation. And then the larger problem, which we've talked about a little bit this week, is that often people believe mis and disinformation not because they think it's true, but because they have other reasons for believing it. Like in the US, the polarization, there's so much support for Donald Trump. Doesn't matter what you tell Trump supporters about the facts, they're not interested in the facts because politics has become a team sport. Next slide, please. Another solution that is both supply side and demand side is the idea of labeling disinformation and creating global standards. So we have a number of initiatives around the world. Reporters Without Borders has set up something called the Journalism Trust Initiative. The idea is that to join this, media outlets have to commit to following certain standards, like publishing corrections or being transparent about the owners of and creating an international set of standards as to what constitutes quality news. And the idea then is if you see an outlet that's in the Journalism Trust Initiative or in the US got a green check from NewsGuard, you will know that you can trust that information. So it's both a supply side and a demand side solution. Again, there are pros and cons. The Americans love stuff like this because they don't want to violate the First Amendment. They don't want regulation, but they're also very skeptical because it looks too much like licensing, which obviously many countries around the world have licenses or professional criteria for journalists, but the Americans are very, very suspicious of that. Next slide. Another proposal as well has been to disclose political advertising and political speech. Right now in the US, we don't really have any regulations for online political advertising. In Europe, obviously, the EU was the first to act and asked Facebook and Twitter to start verifying the identities and the locations of everybody buying political advertisements. And this, of course, is because after 2016, there was worry that the Russians were buying fake ads and using this to spread disinformation. So I won't go into all the details about that here, but this European Union initiative did start to work. Had some effect, and Facebook and Twitter did start to verify the identities of locations of political ad buyers. And then Twitter actually banned political advertising in November 2019. So this is another branch of regulating the supply side. New slide, please. Another attempt, and this was alluded to earlier, is that if we can provide quality information or counter speech, then again, it will counteract some of the mis and disinformation. So we saw attempts all over the world to try to do this. The EU started funding a local effort to combat hate speech. I think we just heard about, was it Parole Stelle in Italy? Trying again to get people not to use certain language to promote quality information. Even YouTube started trying to put more reasonable information, less fanatical stuff high up. Google, Facebook, everyone started providing quality information. In the US, I think there's now more skepticism of this as a solution, that the volume of what Sanchez Sorondo talked about calumny, the volume of poor quality information is so enormous that it's really not enough to promote good quality information. It's just going to get drowned out. So I feel like I could stop soon so that we can maybe have more time for conversation. But what I did, maybe next slide, I can quickly go through. I talked about the attempt by journalists to cover the problems of the tech companies. That's another way of providing information and quality information. Next slide. Next slide. We've already talked about counter speech. Algorithms, of course, which has been what's happened in the United States. So instead of laws about speech, we've had the algorithms automatically suppressing, downranking, and also recommending. So that's supply side. I think in 2016, 2017, there was a hope that the algorithms could solve the problem. And that has become clear that that's not a solution, that the algorithms themselves have created other kinds of problems, including those mentioned earlier, such as discrimination. Next slide. And of course, the algorithms cannot act on their own. You need to have people. And that has caused a huge amount of burnout and psychological distress for the moderators. Part of some of the regulatory attempts like Germany's NetzDG of making the platforms liable has pushed them to hire more moderators. And there's a huge gap between where the problems are and where the moderators are. So much of the violence against Muslims in Burma, for example, or in India has been on WhatsApp, and yet those countries have far fewer moderators than in Europe, where there has been less violence. I don't know, maybe I'll just stop here. It's really, I have lots of slides, and I then talk about some of the pros and cons of regulation. I update on some of the new ideas for regulation, some of the new proposals. It's all changing very, very quickly. Since I did my dissertation, Facebook has launched their Supreme Court, which handed down a decision last week about deplatforming Trump. Germany has updated NetzDG. About 7 African countries have passed fake news laws. Australia has now forced Google and Facebook to actually give money to journalists and media outlets. And so the competition authorities have gotten involved. The European, as some of you mentioned, in December, we saw draft regulation for the European Digital Services Act, and the UK is moving forward on some of theirs. They'll probably have their legislation in 2 years. So we're seeing constant revisions and updates and new proposals, but I'm quite pleased because I feel that this taxonomy has actually really helped me know what to do with all these new proposals and understand where they fit in the larger scheme of things. So I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion. I know I have a question for Marianne Wolf from a couple days ago. Thank you very much.
Yeah.